And so I'm going to talk about designing a color system today. So just a quick show of hands, who uses GitHub? Okay, so you may have noticed last Wednesday, I think it was, the colors changed. And so I'm going to talk about some of the process behind that work. So as I mentioned, I work on design systems. We are organized a bit like an open source project. We have 3 core contributors and I think about 3 core maintainers and about 5 contributors who are spread across different design teams in the organization. And they all helped make this work happen. So first off, why did we need to do this? Why did we need to change the colors? Why did we need to introduce a system? First off, it was a time for an update. We had started to call our old link blue color Dad Jeans blue. It was looking a little bit outdated. Quite a lot of the colors across GitHub were fairly dull, and we needed to do a refresh. And that was on the product, but also the team that works on the logged out home pages, if you've ever looked at those, we're also working on a design update, and they really felt like they needed a better palette. Another problem was that a lot of our colors were not passing color contrast. And that's something that's important to us to make GitHub accessible to more users. And so that was another need for us to update the color palette. And then another big problem was the fact that there wasn't really a system at all. When I started this work, only I guess a few weeks before we launched, there were 2,449 hex values across the site, which makes it very difficult to update things easily and quickly. It makes it very hard for people to know how to use colors consistently. So that was another problem, is that maintenance aspect. So what do I think about and what goes into designing a system, a color system? So when I start this, it's not too different from a product design process. I think about what are the needs of the users. And in this case, it was that I wanted people, our designers and developers at GitHub, to be able to use color with consistency across the site and with confidence that they were using them as intended. And so that's taking into account meaning with color, and also color contrast, and consistency is important for user experience. The components of designing a system for colors was really, well, the color palette. That's probably quite obvious. But also how the colors could be used, and also figuring out how do we ensure these rules can be followed successfully. So that's thinking about documentation, but perhaps also CI tests or linters and things like that. Because I was starting not from scratch, I wasn't creating a new site that didn't already exist. GitHub's been around for a while, and so it's really important to look at what is already there. So doing that research and looking at what are we starting with. Because when we when we make updates like this, we don't want GitHub users to come to the site and suddenly be confused about what red means or what green means. I also spent some time looking at other design systems. So some of the screenshots here are from material design, the US web standards, Solid by BuzzFeed, and the NHS, which is the National Health Service in the UK. And so they all name and organize their colors differently. Material design uses numbers, and they have their base like default of a color at the 500 value, and then go darker and lighter. The US web standards use primary and secondary to organize their colors, and to use lighter and darker and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways that people decide to prioritize and give meaning to their color in their system. So I looked at that, and I also looked at different applications like photo editing apps and other design software, and looked at the types of words that we use to describe color. And I kind of put these into 3 basic categories, which is the name, like red, green, blue, but also descriptors like warm, cool, deep, bright, muted, and purpose. So like that's where things like primary and secondary might come in, but also like foreground and background, which is a bit like how Solid organizes their color utilities. They have like fill and text colors. So what we went with has kind of two parts. So this isn't the full palette, but we did something fairly similar to material design. We created what we call our base color variables. And so we had 500 as the default color, and then went darker and lighter from there, except that we decided to use 000 for the lightest color so that all the code would line up really nicely. But those all map to something, to another, what I would call a functional variable. So that it's something that describes its purpose and how that variable should be used. So every base color variable maps to a foreground or background or border color, and we may also end up having things like fill colors for SVGs. And then those are the variables that are used within our styles throughout the site, which are things like components and utilities, and unfortunately more custom styles than I would like. So how did I go about building the palette? So of course, as any good designer would do when they're working on a color system, you read Interaction of Color by Joseph Albers. This is one of my favorite quotes, and probably a fairly well-known quote. He said, if one says red and there are 50 people listening, it can be expected that there will be 50 reds in their minds, and you can be sure that all those reds will be very different. And that's very true. Like, we're very bad at remembering color. We're kind of bad at describing it. We have different perceptions of what that color is. And so as I started this project, I felt a little bit daunted about that, because I knew that lots of people were going to have quite strong opinions about this. And so it was very important to be collaborative, and it was very important for me to get the system sides of things right and to do a lot of testing. So I used quite a few different applications to help me do this work. Colorable, I used for color contrast testing and also to compare colors. So it was important to me to know at what level colors passed, so that I knew how those colors could be used. And it was also handy for me as I was starting to implement the new system to compare old colors against new and say, okay, they're very close. I think we can swap those out. But I also found myself hunting around for this app called Colorers with 3 Rs. And that let me convert RGB values to hex values, which was useful because a lot of the there was a bunch of alpha RGBA colors in there. And so what I would often end up doing is pasting them into here and then checking the contrast. I also hunted around to find an application where it would show me luminance, which is another way to look at color. I didn't so much find that the most useful value to measure all the colors against, but it was just like another interesting way to look at things for me and to compare different colors in a set and how they look together. I also use Color Snapper a lot because this was also handy when I was testing alpha colors, so that I could color pick those and then paste them back into Colorable and test that as well. And so with all those applications, it definitely left me wanting one color application that could do all of this together. And then for testing color deficiency, I use Spectrum, which is a Chrome plugin. So not only was it important to have good color contrast, to have colors that looked like part of a family and that worked together, but that we were making it easy for people to tell the difference between, colors like red and green. And we still definitely have some work to do there. But we use red, green, and purple quite a lot on GitHub to convey status, like a pull request being open or an issue being open or closed, or something being merged. So that's really important too. So with all of those color applications and testing, I was also in this kind of a little bit crazy workflow. I would be reviewing an existing color, testing a new color, which was the result of a lot of input and discussions from the team. I would tweak that and test that and make sure it worked in the context that it needed to work in. And then I would compare that color to the rest of the palette that I had built up. And I would often like post early on quick screenshots of testing the color out, or just posting a link to a color to say, is this feeling right? Is this the direction you were thinking you would go in? And then I would build out the rest of the family, the different shades, more testing and tweaking and checking like things like the darkest color in a set worked with the lightest color for things like our success messages and alerts. And then I would need to build out the rest of the UI, update the styles, move hexrefs over to the new variables, and share that on our staging environment, which we call Branch Lab, which I then shared with designers, and thankfully a lot of the designers were really awesome in helping me test, and worked in our staging environment as much as possible for the weeks rolling up to this launch, which really helped me uncover a lot of bugs and a lot of places where colors didn't feel right. So that was really valuable. So collaboration was really important there with the testing, but also with code review. You know, I work at GitHub and we use GitHub to build GitHub. And so as I was working on this, I was updating the pull request constantly with what had been updated, and it was in progress for quite a while. And it was one of the good things about being on a remote team is that the design systems team were all in different time zones, and so a couple of times I would wake up to like things being fixed while I was asleep, which was great. So the question is, like, were we successful? Did we do what we set out to do? So I'm kind of curious how this looks on the projector, but this is the old versus new colors. I bet you can't tell the difference right here, right? Which is interesting, being how different it looks in the UI. So I probably should have posted up the color values, but that's the old versus new. We tried to keep in the same family, but the new ones, if you can't see it, a little bit more saturated, a bit brighter, and probably the things that we changed most was making the grays cooler with more of a blue hue, so that they weren't feeling like yellowy and muddy, and making the green a little bit less grassy and a bit more of a blue tinge. And some people may have noticed the blue got a bit brighter as well. One of the other things that we set out to do was, of course, telling people how to use the system. So as I worked on this, I built out the documentation. It's very basic right now, and I'm working with one of our other designers to flesh that out so that people know how to use that color. But I had to build the documentation on the fly and share that with the team, because it wasn't just me that was needing that color palette to update colors, but also the team that were working on the logged out home experience. So this is one of the screens from that. So they were pulling the new colors into their work as I was building out the palette. And so we shipped that, and we shipped the update to the product as well. But the real thing is, like, how was it received? What did users think? So if you Twitter search, after all that work, if you Twitter search GitHub Blue or GitHub Colors, you'll see a lot of thoughts on the new palette. And by the way, I did test that color, and I had a little panic attack that maybe it was the same. I guess everything looks the same on these projectors anyway. But yeah, it's quite different. Also, that theme is called like Midnight Commander, so I was thinking about maybe changing the color name to that now. So yeah, some people, it was met with some mixed reactions. Some people thought it was like way bright and kind of crazy. I'm kind of okay with this as being like, this is how GitHub feels now. This was also one of my favorites. Makes me feel like a chic hipster coder. I'm like, yeah, I'm okay with that. Success. But what it really taught me, this experience really taught me, another quote from Interaction of Color: color is the most relative medium of art. I'm not saying product design is art, but it's definitely relative. Color can be interpreted in very, very different ways. And I was thinking about, like, what do we control and what don't we control? And we can control the palette. We can choose what colors are in that palette. We can control the composition because we design the layouts of the pages. I mean, obviously the different states and what data people put in them, we can't control that, but we can test for a lot of that. But we can't control the context and observation and what people's opinions of these colors are. We can't control whether people have color deficiency issues. We also can't control what type of screen they're looking at these colors on. We can't tell what the quality of the monitors, what operating system, what type of browser they're looking at this stuff in. But we can test for that, and we can try and make sure that it works, you know, okay in that. But we can't fully control it. So you know, I feel like until something is shipped and open in the public, you're not really sure if you did the right thing. So now we're listening to that feedback, and you know, there's still a lot more work to do, including axing another 1,870 hex values, which I'm currently working on. And the last thing I wanted to say is to answer a question I get asked quite a lot working on design systems is, when should an organization start building a design system? And if this project taught me anything, it's as early as possible. Had we had a system in place, we could have maybe spent a little bit more time on exploring palettes. We could have maybe shipped that in a different way. We weren't able to even staff ship it because we couldn't put all of those hex values behind, hex value updates behind a feature flag or anything like that. So it would have changed how we would have been able to ship this and test it and spent time doing research beforehand. So that was definitely a big lesson, but at least now we've got over that first hurdle. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's a question. There's one down here already. Sure. I guess there's the video, so.
There are many optical illusions in which the color looks different based upon what colors surround it or what the colors are next to it.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do to think about those and suggest certain combinations that work, don't work, etc.?
That was difficult. I still feel like I have a ton to learn. I noticed things like when I was working on our navigation, it's hard if people aren't familiar with UI, but we have some tab navigation and it has a highlight color, and immediately above that is often a bright blue link, and then there's a gray background behind that. And I noticed how the background and how the proximity of the blue link were affecting how that color looked. For a while, we explored a kind of a gray highlight color, because we were having trouble with dealing with so many colors, like kind of bright colors close together. And I found that I really needed to look at the hues and how they connected with the other hues there. So when I was testing out the gray, making it closer to the hue of the blue that we were using helped. That's partly why we changed the grays to this blue hue instead of just using the flat, pure grays, because it gave the whole site this kind of muddy feeling and affected all the colors around it. So really the way I went about testing that was, literally looking at these colors close together in the UI, and also just looking at their values, because sometimes that can give you some hints as to how this might, how you can twist the hues and how they might work differently. But yeah, color influence is definitely a thing, and it's hard. So I don't know where.
Hi. As GitHub is super international, did you find out that some associations that say red means all, blue means go, green means good, is different across cultures? Have you looked at the cultural associations of colors to determine what people will interpret, and maybe even do change it up dynamically based on where the idea is from?
That's not something that we've looked at. That was something, I remember working at Etsy, because they also changed the language of the site. That may be something that they looked into a little bit more. But I wouldn't say that, so GitHub is used internationally, but we haven't really dealt with internationalization on the design side too much yet. So that wasn't something that we looked at, but by putting a system in place, it means that we'll be able to do more clever things and change things depending on things like that in the future if we want to and if we can. So definitely like sets the ground and makes that stuff easier, but it's not something that we looked at in this update. I don't know whether yeah.
Yes, hi. One of your stated objective was increase accessibility. Did that extend it to color blindness as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you saw one of the screens, but I did testing with a plugin called Spectrum. I think we still need to do more work on that. I'm in the progress of updating some other parts of the site there. I think there's a few things. I don't think it's just color we need to take into account there. It's also like not just using color alone to convey meaning and things like that. So I think we have some other design issues to deal with on the site to make things easier to use. But yes, definitely looked at color blindness, but definitely need to still keep working on it and making improvements. I'm actually quite lucky. We have a group of colorblind GitHubbers that help with testing that stuff, so I've definitely been reaching out to them to get feedback.
All right.
Okay, done.
Thank you very much.